Good evening, everyone. I'm Christine Catallo. I'm the Director of Library Services and Operations here at Pequot Library. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's author presentation from architectural writer Witold Rybczynski. I'll be turning the microphone over in just a moment to New Canaan architect Robert Dean of Robert Dean Architects, who will say a few words about our wonderful speaker. I first want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of tonight's event, Robert Dean Architects and J.P. Franzen Associates Architects. Their generosity is truly appreciated. I've left a printout with some information on their firms, right on the table when you walk in. As I mentioned, Robert Dean is one of our sponsors, and he'll be introducing the author. Robert founded his firm over 30 years ago after an early career that crossed the boundaries of academia, the construction business, and employment at high-style design firms. Thank you, Robert.
Good evening. As was just pointed out, we're helping out as sponsors along with Jack Franzen of J.P. Franzen Associates, and we love doing this. Excuse me? Is the mic not on? Do I have to get closer? Okay.
Sorry, I'm very short. You have to tilt it.
Okay, thank you. Introducing Witold Rybczynski is a task I relish, except for pronouncing his name, since I have long appreciated his work as a chronicler of design history and its meaning in our world. I'm sure a lot of people here have come into contact with his many books and writings, including The Most Beautiful House in the World, or Home, or his wonderful multi-dimensional portrait of Frederick Law Olmsted, A Clearing in the Distance. His latest book that I believe he'll be speaking about this evening is The Driving Machine, A Design History of the Car, which I'm looking forward to hearing about since automobile design is a particular passion of mine. Professor Rybczynski is the Emeritus Meyerson Professor of Urbanism at the University of Pennsylvania, and his writings are one reflection of a long career as an architect and teacher. Having labored in both of those settings myself, I have enormous respect for Professor Rybczynski's ability to sweep away pretense and speak from the heart to a wide audience. He has a cosmopolitan background with Polish parents, born in Scotland, raised in Scotland, England, and Canada. Having received his bachelor's and master's degrees in architecture from McGill University in Montreal, he then taught at McGill and eventually moved to the United States and distinguished service at the University of Pennsylvania. Along with this, he has practiced architecture, and he's found time to write these lovely books. As a writer, he's been honored with the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize for his Olmsted work. This prize honors a book that exemplifies literary grace and a commitment to serious research and social concern. He also has received numerous awards and appointments, including the Vincent Scully Prize awarded by the National Building Museum, along with an honorary doctorate from McGill, service on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, and others too numerous to mention. We're very fortunate to hear from this distinguished architect and scholar. I've heard automobiles referred to as hollow rolling sculptures, and I can't wait to hear Professor Rybczynski give an architect's understanding of what this may mean. Professor Rybczynski.
That's right, okay. I am going to talk about my new book. That's almost obligatory if you're a writer. But first of all, I'd like to spend some time talking about writing. This is my 22nd book. And although I'm still introduced as an architectural writer, so some years ago I stopped being an architect who wrote, and I started being a writer who happened to be an architect. And my books, I was just looking at it, and only about a third of my books are about architecture. Even though I practiced architecture and I taught in a school of architecture for my whole career, different schools, and but it wasn't something I started writing about. My first 3 books were not about architecture. They were actually about technology. And that was partly because architecture is a hard thing to write about. And secondly, for me, writing was a kind of hobby. I mean, I've never written about things I've taught, and I've never written about the work I do on the research end of being a professor. But writing was an opportunity to do other things and to learn about things. I tend, not consistently, but I've tended to write about things I don't know anything about. I wrote a book called Waiting for the Weekend, which is about the origin of the weekend. Where did we come from? I mean, Napoleon didn't have weekends. Julius Caesar didn't have weekends. The word didn't exist because the institution didn't exist. So but it just kind of interested me. I have no background in sociology. I have a very poor education because after high school, I just went and studied architecture. And in studying architecture, we didn't have electives the way we have today. So you just took architecture courses. So I'm very ignorant in many fields. But so writing was the opportunity. Thankfully, before the internet, you would just go to the library and start rummaging around. And the trick was to find the right shelf, because books were organized by subject matter. So if you could find the right shelf, then you had all these books on leisure, for example, together. Then you would start going through the books and try to find, completely ignorant of who was who. But I found a book that sort of grabbed me in some way. And then I could go to the back of the book and get the bibliography, and then I could find other books. And so it was a sort of exploration for me, and it satisfied curiosity rather than sort of preaching. Because one of my early books, I quoted Milan Kundera, and it's a quote that has stuck with me over the years because I think it's really true. And he said that to be a writer does not mean to preach a truth. It means to discover a truth. I don't want to say that my books have great truths in them, but I've always believed in that approach. I think writers who set out to convince you of something are sort of, first of all, they're boring because you know from the beginning, page 1, what they're trying to sell to you. And I was never trying to sell, I was trying to understand and then bring the reader along as I went into this field. People have sometimes described, almost accused, that I popularize a subject. But I just write the best way I can. I mean, if I could write like Mickey Spillane, I would write those kind of books, but I can't. Only he could. And every writer writes as best he can, and we just have different talents. You don't set out to reach a certain audience. First of all, because you don't have an audience. You have to remember that the first book, there is no audience. You can't imagine anyone actually wanting to read what you've written. And you've never had the experience of reviews or readers coming up to you and saying how much I enjoyed it. I mean, other than my wife was about the only person that read my book. So when you write a book and it sort of, you send it out into the world, you have no idea, first of all, who will read it, and whether they'll read it, and anyway, you're thinking about the next book. And because it takes about a year, or used to, close to a year to produce a book, so you finish the book. By the time it comes out, you're already involved in something else, so you're not really thinking of readers. So the notion that you write a book with a reader in mind, I think some writers can do that. I certainly couldn't, because I remember when Home was my first, not my first book, it was my third book, but it wasn't my first book that was successful, that got reviewed in many places, and I remember after a while I would get letters from readers, and we would call them the letterhead ladies, because they were all ladies who had fancy letterheads with sort of graphic things. And I was starting to worry that this was my audience. This was who I was writing for, not intentionally, but it seemed to work. And then, of course, over the years, and the great advantage, I pity writers who die young, because you miss out on feedback from people who say, oh, I was a teenager and this was in our high school course or something like that. And then you realize you do reach many, many people in an odd way that you don't plan to. Waiting for the Weekend was this book I wrote about the weekend and leisure. And I remember years later meeting, actually on the street where we lived in Philadelphia, it was a lawyer couple. And he said, that book changed my life. He said, I was working on this high-powered law firm, and it was killing me, because lawyers work, they're paid a lot, and they're not very popular, but they do work awfully hard for that money. And he told me how he read this book, and he just changed. He quit the big firm and got, still working as a lawyer, but in a kind of much less pressurized profession, because a lot of Waiting for the Weekend is about leisure. After all, that's the whole point of the weekend, is that you have time for yourself, time to do other things than work. Although I also remember quoting, I think it was not Oscar Wilde, but I can't remember his name, an English actor who said, work is more fun than fun. And I believe that. I think writing is more fun than fun. And I don't, unfortunately, have hobbies, nor do I have an enormous interest in cars. I've never been to a car show. So I'll talk about this book later. I've owned many cars, but not as a collector, not as somebody who was sort of a car nut. I know sort of how they work, but not really. I have no deep knowledge. It's certainly not a tinkerer. The other quote that I wanted to mention at the beginning, because it's also, I think, I wouldn't say it influenced me, but I think it characterizes what I've written. And that was a quote from Samuel Goldwyn, the Hollywood producer. And that's why you should turn your phone off. You throw me off. Samuel Goldwyn, a Hollywood producer, and he was being interviewed. And the interviewer said, Mr. Goldwyn, they were talking about his latest movie. He said, what's the message of this movie? And Samuel Goldwyn said, if I wanted a message, I'd use Western Union. And I think books are like that. A book with a message is not a book I'm interested in reading. I mean, I can just read the message, and then why read the whole book? So a book that explores, that ends up here rather than here, that takes the reader and obviously the writer somewhere, is always much more interesting to read. Also, maybe I just have a short attention span, because I've written books about tools and the car. I wrote a book about the history, which is closest to this, the history of the chair, which sort of, it's a longer history than the car. And it's very different in many ways. Cars disappear, whereas chairs don't. We still sit in rocking chairs the way, I can't remember, it was a Philadelphia invention, in fact, and initially for mothers, so that they could sit with a baby, and rather than have a cradle, they would sort of rock the baby. And they were, I forget the name now, but they were sold as sort of nursing chairs. And then they became more popular. Something that completely perplexed Europeans. They didn't understand this idea of perpetual motion. They thought Americans were nutty. I mean, they thought Americans were nutty for many other reasons as well, but the rocking chair was one of the sort of things that really clinched it, because the whole idea, and of course the whole idea of a rocking chair is that you don't rock continually. It allows you to change the angle and put your feet up, which is also, I've discovered, an American custom. We all remember our parents saying, stop that, you'll break the chair, which is true. You do break the chair when you put all the weight on the two back legs and sort of, but there are many old photographs of American men especially sitting that way. an American custom. And it's something to do with breaking rules, maybe. That this isn't the way you're supposed to sit on a chair, so we're going to sit on a chair that way, because we're Americans. We can do what, it's a free country. And so there's something of that in it. And just as a footnote, when Thonnet, who invented the bentwood chair in Central Europe, eventually they started exporting to America. And then they discovered their chairs were breaking because of the way Americans sat on them, and they had to reinforce the back legs, especially for the American market. So curiosity is really what starts books for me. Although not only, many things start books, but one of the things is curiosity. And I wrote a book about cities. This is the first book I wrote about cities, and then I became a professor of urbanism, so now I'm an expert. But I'd never written a book about cities, and I remember two friends of mine this was when we were living in Montreal, and she had gone to Europe for the first time. And she went to Paris. She was French speaking, so Paris was a kind of north. And she was, like most people, floored. I mean, she had no idea what it was like, that it was like that. And she had a wonderful time, and was very impressed. But we were having dinner after she returned, and she said, "Why aren't our cities like that?" And she was kind of accusatory. You know, why did you architects didn't do that? Why did you do what you did rather than Paris? It's so beautiful. A city, I had no idea a city could be like that. And that kind of, it was a good question. I didn't have an answer, but it was a good question. That's what started me thinking about, well, why are our cities like that? And there are many reasons. It's a big country. There was lots of space to spread out. Our cities were built in a relatively short period of time. They were dominated by trains and then automobiles. So there's all sorts of reasons. The ultimate reason, the ultimate discovery, I suppose, of the book was that the cities are that way because that's what we wanted. It's not an accident. Those are the cities we wanted. We didn't want to build Paris. We could have built Paris. We were the richest society in the world. And there were attempts to build Paris, the City Beautiful movement, for instance. But ultimately, we wanted the freedom. And because it was a big country, we could spread out. So there was nothing forcing cities to be compact and the way European cities are. I want to keep an eye on things here. Architectural writing, I wrote a book about building our own house with my wife, and this was still back in Canada. And that was the first time I sort of wrote a book which was slightly about architecture. It wasn't about famous architects, and it wasn't a do-it-yourself book. It was sort of trying to, I built our house several years before. So I had no idea of writing about it. But I remember we went to an academic sort of trip to China, and this was in the 80s, I guess. And you visit universities. In those days, you were kind of controlled. So every night we're sitting around, and we met a Belgian professor and so we would sort of talk, have conversation in the evening, because you weren't prisoners, but it was sort of like that. In the sense, you couldn't go anywhere because you weren't mobile. You didn't really. And at one point, I told him the story of building our own house, because we built it literally ourselves, no electricity. And this Belgian professor said, "Well, you should write about that. That would be," and I never thought about that, and that was how that book started. It was the encouragement of somebody who said, "This is an interesting story." The last beginning that I could mention, I wrote a book 2 or 3 books ago called Charleston Fancy, and it was on the one hand a very hard book to write, and on the other hand very satisfying, because it's a book that brings together 3 things that I've written about separately, which is urbanism, cities, particularly Charleston, which is a great sort of urban history, a beautiful city, and architecture, because it's about people building sort of infill housing in the middle of Charleston, and also real estate development. I taught in the Wharton School, not because I know anything about real estate, but they wanted somebody to teach them, their students, something about design, because some real estate students want to be developers, and so they have courses in law and economics and finance, but they don't have any courses in the physical stuff. And so that was what I taught for about 20 years. And so I got to know developers and economists, where most of the professors were. And so I wrote about real estate. Basically, it was a book following a project. And it also started with a question, because where do you go to the country on a Sunday drive. People still do that. I don't know, Sunday drives, it dates me. But you go to the country, and then suddenly there's houses. It was a beautiful sort of sylvan landscape, and it's all covered with little houses. And where do they come from? And how they seem to just pop up suddenly. And so it was that was the question I wanted to explore, to follow it, to go, where does it start from? Well, it obviously starts with, the name of the book was Last Harvest, because the last harvest is when the farmer's ready to retire. The last harvest is you sell the farm, and then you go to Boca Raton or somewhere and retire, which is what in fact, in this story, what happened. But it was that's the beginning, and then there's a developer, and then there's the people who live there. There are innumerable town meetings and discussions, because you have to get approval for all these things, and so on. And so I followed a project in real time, right into 2008, when the whole thing collapsed. Not my project, the whole real estate market collapsed. So it was a very kind of dramatic ending for the book, but not unusual. I mean, that is the real estate business. Anyway, I wrote this book about Charleston, which was also about real estate development. And so I had these three themes, and I had the hardest time convincing an editor that there was a book here, because I didn't really understand that it was about three themes. It was something that eventually developed, but I couldn't sort of explain because I had met these people. They were doing these projects. I met them sort of 30 years earlier, so I knew these people over the years, and it just didn't sound like it would work. And I wasn't sure how to write the book, because I wasn't, it seemed sort of pedestrian to say, well, they started building little houses in the center of Charleston, and the main protagonist, George Holt, is actually not an architect. He's a contractor who sort of taught himself architecture, but he loves Byzantine architecture. He would go to Istanbul regularly, and his own house is Byzantine. It's got the domes, everything, columns, the sort of decorated columns that Byzantine architects love. And it was an interesting story, but I couldn't figure out how do you tell such a story. And his house burnt down. Our common friend calls me up and said, George's house just burnt down. And God forgive me, I thought, that's it. I've got it. That's going to be where it begins. It begins with his house burning down, and then you tell the rest of the story. And I admit I was thinking of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, but that started with a murder, and the house burning down is not a murder, but it's close. It's dramatic, and nobody got murdered in my story, but there were other projects that took place. So it was a way of entering the story that somehow I thought would bring people into it. And then, of course, Charleston is such an interesting city. It has a interesting history. There was all these different strands that ran through the book. I think I'm going to switch now and talk about my latest book, which is The Driving Machine, which is, as I said, I'm not a car nut. I've owned a lot of cars, and I guess partly I was trying to figure out why that was. And partly I was trying to figure out something about like, where do these cars come from? Because there's a picture of a industrial building in Philadelphia. The photograph is probably 1905 or, I'm sorry, 1920s, 15 or 20. And those cars parked there, you can't really see them, they're too small, but they're mostly Ford Model A's, which was the Ford that followed the Model T. And they were sort of boxy, but they already had a body that was enclosed. And of course, none of you have ever seen such a car, I suspect. None of you have driven such a car. And I've never seen a Ford Model A. And you don't see them, but the building is still there. I live in this building. It was converted into condominiums, into lofts. And this building is now 115 years old. So the big difference in design between cars and buildings, and of course I'm an architect, so I sort of started with that contrast, is buildings last hundreds of years. We're in a building that's well over, what is it, 1880s or something like that. You don't see any cars, well, there were no cars in 1880, but you don't see any cars of any age. So they last maybe 20 years, 25. If they're really good cars, they should last 30 years, good German cars. We probably won't see any German cars in the future, so it'll be like an archaeological sort of thing. But cars don't last very long, so they sort of disappear, and then we forget about them. So I remember I would see Beetles for the longest, Volkswagen Beetles. And then you would see, once a year you would see one, and then they kind of disappeared completely. You never see them on the street. I don't mean going to a show or a museum, but just driving down the street. And cars just disappear, so we forget them. So there's also that question. So there's a big difference between the design of a car and the design of a building. Even though I would argue as much effort goes into the design of a car as a building, maybe even more. If you sort of man hours, thousands of people worked on the Edsel for what it was worth. But a lot of man hours go into that. So because you're going to mass produce them and so on. What I'm going to do is sort of really squeeze this down and talk about 3 cars. But they cover a long period, 1885, which is the first car, which I'll talk about at the end, and up to about 2005. And the first type of car I want to talk about was a car for everyone. And of course, that was the great discovery of Henry Ford, or the goal. He didn't set out to do it right away. He kind of got into the water with higher priced cars, but that was his dream, was to make a car that any working man could afford. And that's what he did. And it's interesting, Ford was not interested in design. It's an ugly car. There's nothing particularly ingenious about the design. It uses very good technology. It's a car before roads, so it's really an off-road vehicle. If you see pictures of Model Ts driving through a field, for instance, the wheels are all going like this. I mean, it had to be a car for a place with no roads. And it was a rural car. It was not America had terrific mass transit in the cities, so you weren't going to sell cars easily to people who would just jump on a streetcar and go down the straight line, and streetcars were laid out to take you places and so on. But farmers, or people in small towns, at that point probably more than half the population, needed something to get around. And remember, Ford's sold these on the basis that when you park a car, it just sits there. If you park a horse, you have to feed it. So there's a huge difference between horse-drawn versus this. You of course, use gasoline and so on, but when it's sitting there, it's just sitting there. You don't have to take care of it. You don't have to coddle it and feed it and then groom it and all that stuff. So it sort of sold itself. And of course, he reduced the price all the time, so the price got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. What's interesting to point out is the designers of the car, 2 of the 3 designers and the main designer, Galam, were Hungarians. And Central Europe was a real hotbed of car design. For some reason, I don't understand all of them, but the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, so Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, that's where the car, and then southern Germany became a center of car production in Europe because it was close to what had been. Eventually these became separate countries. So this is interesting to compare the 2 approaches to a cheap car. Because the Austin 7 was called the Baby Austin, and this was after the First World War. The fancy cars there was no market for fancy cars in Europe. And so Herbert Austin himself designed this car, and basically what he did was he shrank the car. This car is about 8 feet long, and it weighs, I can't remember the numbers, but it's very light, so it has a tiny motor, no trunk. But a kind of sort of semi-enclosed with a canvas roof. So only a 2-door, but everything is done to shrink sort of a conventional car and make it smaller. Whereas Ledwinka, who was a Austrian engineer who worked for Tatra, which was a Czech company, very important company in terms of car design. He designed a car that was different because it was trying to be smaller. So for instance, this car has an air-cooled engine. That's why there's no grill on it. So you get rid of the radiator because you want to make the car as light as possible. Then you can put the smallest engine possible, and then you can save a lot of money. He had a very ingenious chassis because the chassis is, instead of a platform, it's like a spine. There's a tube running down the middle. That's the chassis. And then it connects to the wheels at the front and back. And inside the tube is the drive shaft. So very ingenious. Because it's a rear-wheel drive. The engine's in the front. And so Ledwinka is really coming up with a new kind of car, trying to solve a small, inexpensive car. The other engineer is Ferdinand Porsche, who was a Czech engineer. And he worked in Austria for a number of years, and then it was clear that Germany, bigger country, bigger market, was the place. And so he moved to Germany, and he started a kind of consulting business designing cars and engines and things. And these were 2 cars that he designed. They were not built because Zundab was a motorcycle company, and they wanted to get into small cars to make the sort of big step. And then they got scared. It was costing too much. It takes too long, and so they thought we better stick to motorcycles. And NSU was a company where he a little bit later he took a lot of the ideas from the first car, and you can sort of see it looks like a kind of third cousin of a Volkswagen Beetle. It's got already a lot of things. The problem was that NSU ended up being bought by Fiat. Fiat was one of the biggest car companies in Europe at that point. And Fiat was not interested in anything. They wanted the factory so they could produce Fiats in Germany. So this was shelved, but it clearly has influences because it's Porsche who designs the Volkswagen Beetle, which is a beautiful car. It's truly a beautiful design. Komenda was a Austrian engineer who was in charge of the body design, and he designed the first Porsche sports car for the Sun. And you can see how this is almost like you just make it a 2-seater, make it a bit lower, and you end up with the classic Porsche, which goes on for a long time in many different iterations. There's a whole story, of course. This is a Nazi car. I mean, poor Tesla's getting beat up, but this is a real Nazi car. This was Hitler's idea. And I tell this whole story. It's too long and involved to do here. Kraft durch Freude is strength through joy. And this was the German, the National Socialists eliminated trade unions. They had one trade union, a national trade union, and the trade union had a organization that organized leisure time. They owned, for instance, steamships. They had ocean liners. They had camps in the mountains. They had camps by the beach for workers, and they would get. And you know, the Germans had this interest in nature, and that was all kind of wrapped up in it. So the car ended up being financed by this, and it just came on in 1938, and of course the war broke out. And so it got produced for the army a little bit, and it wasn't until 1949 that it really becomes. But it's an identical design. Nothing changes. The Volkswagen wasn't the first small car. The Topolino was the Italian version of a small car for a large market. The Fiat didn't want to cut into the sales of its regular small cars, so it's actually a two-seater. It's a two-seater with space for a kid behind the seat, or a little bit of luggage. It has no trunk at this point. Topolino is the Italian name for Mickey Mouse because it has these two very large headlights. And from the front, it looks like that Mickey Mouse with the round ears. Very beautiful design. And the Citroën, which comes out a year later, 2 years later, was the French version. And the French, being the French, do something that nobody else does. And it's fascinating because their whole approach to car design is different. And they produce one of the reasons from a design point of view is different, that Flaminio Bertoni was an artist. He wasn't an engineer. He was a transplanted Italian, and Citroën just wanted some aesthetic input. And if you want aesthetic input, you shouldn't ask an engineer because they're not trained in that. Whereas there are pictures of him with clay models of the car. He was later responsible for the beautiful Citroën DS, which is a spectacularly beautiful car. But all these cars the French cars were very different. And for instance, it has a canvas roof. Both these cars have a canvas roof, not because they want to give you a convertible. It's just cheaper and lighter. And it lowers the center of gravity of the car, so the car becomes more. And their basic approach is to get everything as light as possible, and then the car can have a very small engine. And the second category is what I call the better tool. When Ford didn't actually produce the bodies of its cars. Ford produced the chassis. The bodies were made by other people, and you could just buy a chassis. They would have an engine, the steering wheel, the front seats, and then you could get a bodybuilder to build you, for instance, a pickup truck. Ford did not sell pickup trucks at that point. And one of the popular cars was called it was called the depot hack, and it was for picking up people at the railroad depot. It was like a taxi in a way. It had it was often the bodies were made out of wood for some reason, probably just because it's cheaper to do carpentry than to set up a complicated metal shop. And they became very popular. Eventually, they called them station wagons. So the station. And it was an open car. It was really for summertime or warm climates. And Ford finally, these were so popular, so when the Ford Model A came out, Ford decided to have to offer the station wagon as an option. This was the most expensive car that they made. So this was a luxury car. And they would promote it that way. This was a car so you could take guests to your estate. Or you could take guests to a country inn, for instance. So it sat 6 people. It was open. It was clearly a summertime kind of thing. It had a reinforced sort of trunk, so you could place a real trunk on it. It was solid enough to do that. And it's, of course, a crazy idea. Wood is not a good material for a car. It doesn't last. You have to varnish it sort of many times a season. It's heavy, so the whole thing compared to metal. it creaks when you're driving because it's wood, it's not metal. And of course, that was part of the attraction. This was like, I compared it, it's like wearing white clothes when you play tennis. It's to show that you're rich enough that you can play tennis and then throw them all, and the servants will launder them for you. So the fact that this, and it was, as I said, the most expensive car in Ford's lineup was the station wagon. They didn't sell a huge number, but they sold enough that it sort of became a thing, this idea of wood. And Ford eventually built one that was much more like a station wagon. It was an enclosed. They finally got real windows everywhere, and it became an enclosed car, but still with the wood. And eventually, by the 70s, you sort of get fake wood applied. And there's sort of the last generation of station wagons, because station wagons disappear at one point, except in Sweden and Germany and France. They're not called station wagons. They all have different names for these cars, but especially in Germany and Sweden, people just like them. So if you want a station wagon today, it has to be an Audi or a Volvo, because nobody else makes them. And I forget the date of the last American one, but it's sometime in the late 70s. It gets replaced essentially by the minivan. Chevrolet was competing with Ford, and what Chevrolet did, at one point they decided they needed a station wagon, but rather than build one out of wood, they took a delivery van and cut windows in it. The doors, of course, delivery vans only have 2 doors, so this car only has 2 doors, and the seats fold back. But they cut more windows, but that meant it was all metal. It was much cheaper than a wooden, the so-called Woody, as they became to be known. What's interesting about the Chevrolet Suburban Carryall, they dropped the Carryall. The Chevrolet Suburban is one of the longest running marques of any car anywhere, because it just keeps going. Today, the Secret Service seems to like Chevy Suburbans. They're big and they can drive, at least according to movies, which is all I know about these. But these cars have a star on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood because they were used in so many movies. The Suburbans, not these cars, but their descendant. The other kind of stream that feeds into this is the U.S. Army Jeep, which is a really interesting story and a very interesting car because it's almost a pure form follows function. The Army sets up exactly what they want. This was done just at the very beginning of the war. They gave the producers very little time, and they had all these requirements, and this sort of result was this. And it of course becomes a classic car, a design that somehow lasts, and eventually in 1945, the same company makes civilian versions of it. And that continues for a long time, for 41 years. They're pretty awful today. They lost the touch at some point, the Jeep company. But the Jeep company, this carries the company or whoever owns it, because it changes hands a lot. And there's something very appealing about them. Maybe it's the post-war generation and the connection with the war, I don't. The British had their own version designed after the end of the war, and Britain was in, of course, terrible position economically after the war, and the Wilkes brothers were people running Rover, and they said, well, we can't, we're a company that makes very upscale cars, but we can't sell them. The government won't allow us to sell luxury cars. We got to sell something that we can export. And Morris Wilkes, who was in charge of production, had an American Jeep on his farm. And he said, well, what if we made a car for agriculture? We could probably get around, the British government had all kind of rules, but if you developed a car for export, and it was a sort of agricultural car, you could get around some of these restrictions. And this was the result, and they actually used a Jeep chassis for the first sort of prototypes, but they wanted to keep the body very simple because they didn't want to get into sort of three-dimensional curves, and that's where you get these funny two-dimensional curves which create this very striking appearance. And this car which starts off as a sort of desperate attempt to produce a car that they can actually sell and keep the company alive, sort of grabs the imagination, proves to be very useful. It seats more people than a Jeep, because you see the body goes out to the edges rather than in. And so it was used on safaris, it was used by the military, it was all kind of applications. Otherwise, it's very similar to a Jeep. It's a four-wheel drive. It has, as I said, virtually the same dimensions. And then at one point, after, let me just see, this starts in 48. So about 20 years later, they make, in the meantime, attempts to make a bigger version, because a Land Rover is a pretty small car. And so, they base it on the Ford, I can't remember I always forget the name. There was a Ford Jeep version, which they used as a sort of model, and they came up with the Range Rover. And the Range Rover is so interesting because it was not designed as an upscale car. Today we think of Range Rovers, you have to be either a drug lord or the Queen of England or somebody very important and rich. The car was not designed like that at all. The original Range Rover was all plastic inside, and the idea was you could hose it down. And so they had no concept of this is going to be sort of a chintzy car. And it was designed by engineers and not sort of given they didn't hire some stylist to dress it up. It turned out the way it has very high windows. So that I think still one of the most beautiful SUVs produced. There's been lots of SUVs after, but including Range Rovers, which look kind of generic at this point. They could be anything. But the original one is really quite beautiful. The first car was designed by Carl and Bertha Benz in 1885. And there's several things here. One, it really was designed by both of them. Bertha, who I'll talk a little bit about, was technically inclined, and so she was very much involved in the work. And most people have felt that in another time her name would be in all the patents, not just his name, because she was very deeply involved. She was financially involved too, because she came from a wealthy family. He didn't. He came from a very low, poor family. And so she arranged to have her dowry given to him, actually before they married, because he had the opportunity to buy a factory, a bicycle factory. That's why this looks a bit like a bicycle, because it's got tubing, it doesn't. The other thing that's important to know, this is not like the Wright brothers, who are just trying to get off the ground, and then this is designed to be sold. This is part of a business sort of plan. This was not just a weird experiment. This was going to be sold to people, and he started a company, and it was going to be produced in larger numbers. So like the Ford Model T, this was a car for a market. It wasn't just an experiment, although this is the first car. He designed everything. The engine, first of all, it's an internal combustion engine. It has several gears. It's only a tricycle. The front wheel is a single wheel. Later on, he figures out how to have two wheels, and he designs the mechanism for. So in 1885, he produces this, but it doesn't really do very well. He's not, like many people, Ford is an exception. He's not a good businessman, basically. And so he's built one, it runs, people, it's the first car after all. But it kind of stalls, nothing really happens. Here's a picture from, I think about 1910, 1920, and one of the things about writing this book, cars are a guy thing. There's nothing you can do about that. I came across one woman designer who worked for, did the interiors of all the Nash cars. She was German originally, had been trained as an industrial artist, and was responsible for the interior. But otherwise, it's a guy thing. Most of the pioneers of cars love racing. Ford Ford had the world land speed record for a number of years. I mean, they're mechanics, they're tinkerers. The Europeans tend to be engineers more formally, and eventually the Americans also become, the people involved with the cars tend to have a formal background. That's his wife, Bertha, and she turns out to be actually a very important person, not only because she was involved in the design of the car, but also because she was impatient with him. This is 3 years after, you know, she's put all her money into it, after all, and it's not going anywhere. They're not selling very many, and that was the whole point, is that it's to start a business. And so one evening he comes home and there's a note from her saying, "I've gone to see my mother who lives about 60 miles away. And I've taken the 2 boys and I'll be back, don't worry, in a couple of days." What she doesn't say is that she took the car. And she makes the first long distance journey in a car, 65 miles. So she's actually a very important person. And this is when, the photograph, of course, she's a kind of matron, but she had 5 children. She's one of these wonder women who's good at everything, I think. And the blue line is her route down from Mannheim, where they lived, to Pforzheim, which was where her mother lived, where she grew up. And those the three little circles, there's no service stations. So she stops at pharmacists and buys alcohol-based like spot cleaner, and uses that as a fuel in the car. And as I said, she's quite conversant with the car. That the 4th blue circle at the bottom this is actually a very hilly terrain. It looks flat, but it's mountainous, and so the brakes are getting worn out. They had wooden brakes. And she stops at a cobbler, and she has leather pads made for the brakes. In other words, she invents brake pads. and does other sort of weird stuff. She then arrives at her mother's place, and then a few weeks later, they drive back north. And that proves that this is really something that is useful, that it works, that I hate to say it, but that a woman could drive it is I think, part of her sort of thinking on this. And eventually, Carl Benz becomes the largest car producer in Germany, and then eventually he and Daimler, who's the other car producer, form a joint company. The most successful car of Daimler is called the Mercedes, which is a woman's name, and there's a whole reason why. But that's what was famous, not Daimler, but Mercedes. So they called the company Mercedes-Benz. And of course, the rest is history. Let me just read you the final. The end of the book, basically, the last paragraph. Driving an automobile, whether it's powered by an internal combustion engine or an electric motor, is an intimate experience, driver and machine. Driving provides an opportunity for the exercise of personal control, as well as a feeling of movement and speed, and above all, a sense of freedom. This was equally true of the automobile's predecessor. Isabel Archer is the willful young heroine of Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady. And Isabel tells a friend, and I quote, "A swift carriage of a dark night, rattling with 4 horses over roads that one can't see. That's my idea of happiness." She means it as a metaphor for life, sort of not being hemmed in by rules. But it's telling nonetheless. In James's time, there was an assortment of personal carriages, gigs and traps, phaetons and surreys, barouches and landaus, fast and slow, lavish and functional, sporty and workaday. Yet the end of the horse-drawn era was coming, foretold on that fateful summer's day in August 1888, when Bertha Benz took her husband's noisy contraption on her famous 65-mile ride. I imagine the indomitable Bertha adjusting the carburetor, grasping the steering handle with one hand and the power lever with the other, and calling out to Eugene and Richard, "Push, boys, push." Thank you. Do we have time for questions? I don't want to overstay my welcome. Is there? I guess we do. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer.
I was interested about your mention about the urbanistic of the automobiles that create cities and towns. As you know, the American cities are built around cars, so the cars can go through from one city to another. And then we have the transition to the mall that dictated a different urbanistic. Now that the malls are becoming more obsolete, where do you see the next urbanistic design go?
I mean, this isn't a social history, so I didn't go deeply into the questions you raised, except I did admit that the car is a mixed blessing. Cars are not responsible for suburbs. Suburbs start before the car in the United States, but they certainly accelerate it. The car makes it. The first suburbs, you either went by train or by boat up the Hudson, but of course with cars, you weren't tied to a railway line or a river. You could go everywhere. So it accelerates it and develops it further. And because there's so much space, you can do that. On the other hand, it seemed, I can't remember where I read this, but I remember reading once a study of car ownership internationally. And they basically, the conclusion of the study was that the only restriction on car ownership internationally was income. I mean, the moment people had enough money, they'd buy a car. And we know that's, and this I'm talking now probably the 70s or 80s when I read this, but we now know that's absolutely true. It's true in China. It's true or will be true in India. And so it's simply a question of money, because that sense of freedom is almost, it's not an American thing at all, as I would have thought it might be. It's a human thing, and having that freedom seems to appeal to everybody. I mean, of course, there are all kinds of problems associated with that, so obviously. But cities have always, of course, been formed by transportation, whether it's horses. Well, before, when everybody's walking, that limits the city considerably. But then you have horses, and then horse-drawn omnibuses and things like that, and eventually streetcars, which create these linear cities. And so it's not unusual, and what was unusual is that we didn't expect it, and it had all sorts of unexpected consequences, as all these things in fact do. I mean, so for example, if you're commuting by car, you don't have an evening newspaper, because you can't read a newspaper while you're driving. So one of the reasons, whereas if you're sitting on a streetcar going home at night, you buy a newspaper and you get the evening news as well as the morning news. On the other hand, what do you have in a car? You have a radio. Eventually, very quickly in America, radios become standard things in cars. And so you get talk radio, and with all the effects of that, which of course completely unexpected and take us in another direction. So I think with technology, it's very difficult, because you know there's going to be unexpected consequences. I remember I was involved with solar energy research as a young architect, and I remember reading a study by somebody who calculated, and this was when solar panels were on roofs, but they were usually circulating water or air. This is before solar cells. And somebody had worked out how many people would get hurt falling off a roof when they're maintaining their solar collector. And of course, what's true is there is no perfect technology. I mean, electric cars are not perfect. I heard somebody describing, for instance, an internal combustion engine is an extremely complicated thing. I made all kind of small errors in my book, which will be corrected in paperback, but there's just an awful lot going on in the engine. The fuel is dead simple. You just pour some gasoline in, and all you need is a container, a gas tank. Whereas an electric car, the electric motors are dead simple. They're very efficient, they're very small, nothing complicated. The fuel is extremely complicated. Making those batteries and all the rare earth coming from God knows where, that's really complicated stuff. So it looks simple on one hand, but it's not, it's complicated on the other hand. You've just sort of shifted things. And you can't, Bertha Benz could stop at a pharmacy and sort of make do. With an electric car, I write about electric cars in the book quite a bit, because at the beginning, of course, nobody knew what fuel would work for a car. Would it be electricity? Would it be gasoline or steam? Steam was actually the leader because it had the longest history. We understood steam. And so electric cars start very early, but one of the limitations, apart from the weight of the batteries, because in those days, with cell batteries, they were very, very heavy. But the big difference was there was no electricity outside the city. So you couldn't go outside the city. So one of the most successful early examples came out of Philadelphia were taxis. Because taxis don't take you miles outside. They run around the city, and then the taxi station, you can switch batteries and put a fresh battery in. So it's a very sort of sensible, logical thing. But the idea of a car that you go outside the city, it can't be electric, because nobody has electricity outside the city. And that's much later. So I think, I have no idea. I did have one thought about the future. One is that if you really get self-driving cars, the car will sort of become just a kind of utensil. You won't even have to own it, really. I mean, it's not a personal thing. It just becomes a kind of utility, a decentralized utility. But then I thought, what will happen to the internal combustion engine car? Does it disappear? Or, for instance, do people start driving those cars? People go sailing. People go horseback riding. So when the horses were replaced by cars, then the horse became a hobby. And so maybe internal combustion engine cars become a hobby. And not necessarily only for racing, but just for driving and piddling around. I'm fascinated by boats. I have no I get on a boat and then I realize what a mistake it is, how boring it is. But I'm fascinated by sailboats and the whole sort of technology of them. And, it's an incredibly complicated sort of hobby to have. So you can imagine people having internal combustion engine cars. I don't have a car anymore, but I can't imagine driving an electric car. It doesn't make any noise. I mean, the noise was the nicest thing of those cars. And everything's sort of electronic or digital, and you don't really understand how anything works. And you're totally distracted because you're trying to figure out how the screen works. I mean, I use a computer. I'm not a Luddite, but my computer is very unreliable. It's always something changes. So all you do is you boot it up again, and then you continue. But it's always doing weird things. I'd hate to be doing weird things at 80 miles an hour. I mean, so I'm a skeptic when it comes to electric cars, but that's just because that's generational. I mean, I was raised with a certain kind of car where you could fiddle around with it a little bit, and where it had character. It wasn't designed by a committee, but that is obviously clear. What is clear to me when I finish the book is that we're at the end of something. and beginning of something new. I mean, where the new things will go, who knows? And most changes in technology, you give up something and you get something, or the other way around, perhaps. You get some advantages, but you've given up something at the same time. But that's sort of the history of technical development anyway. But it's clear that we're at the end of a certain period. Actually, it ended probably in the 80s, where the last sort of cars, where everything sort of came to a point where we had all the technologies we needed. We had intermittent wipers, we had anti-lock brakes. I mean, we had all sorts of things that all came together, and there was nothing left to design. And so then then electricity comes in, and it all goes in another direction. But although somebody asked me in an interview if there were some leftover things or traditional things that all cars have, and I thought there's two things that all cars have. One is windshield wipers. We haven't invented a better windshield wiper. Mercedes had a very interesting windshield wiper. It was a single wiper, but it had two movements, not just this, but this. And it cleaned more of your windshield, and it was just one wiper. The trouble was it was very expensive if it broke. And it was a complicated piece of machinery because it had two motions. It had this motion and this motion. So I've not seen anybody else, including Mercedes, do that. But windshield wipers start right at the very beginning because it just somehow is the best. The first ones are hand operated. So you drive with one hand and you do this, or you do it once in a while or something like that. But eventually because the first cars didn't have batteries usually, so the other thing which is interesting that has hung on is the rear view mirror. We haven't figured out anything better. Eventually, I suppose, we'll have rear view cameras, which we already have, but that will maybe replace the rear view mirror. But that's a funny kind of leftover. It was invented by I think an Italian race car driver who wanted to see, who was coming up behind him. But the first cars don't have rear view mirrors. But very quickly, people realize it works. And then it just hangs around. And some of the cars mount mirrors way up front on the engine compartment. And then they get closer as they are able to manipulate the glass. So I don't think I would want to guess where the car goes, except the attraction of the freedom of a car seems to be, it seems to have, that's what drove the car. Whether it will continue to be an important thing, I don't know. It's hard to say. The one thing I can say about technology, having written about it, is that it's very difficult to predict. It's almost guaranteed that you'll be wrong, or you'll miss some aspect of it, good or bad. I was going to talk a little bit about the fact that one of the interesting things about cars is that cars are made for one reason, and then it turns out people like it and it becomes something else. But conversely, if you make a great car but it's too early, it dies. If you come up with a sort of SUV type car in the 50s or 60s, nobody knows what it is. Like, is it a car? Is it a truck? What do I use it for? And Jeep did a four-wheel drive station wagon. It was a failure because people didn't know about it. And so, on the other hand, I mentioned the Range Rover. People liked it as a status symbol. They didn't drive across the Sahara in it. I mean, not many people did. But there was something about, but it was swinging London. It was people with lots of money, and it was a kind of not like other cars, so it was a kind of poke in the eye for conventional fancy sports cars, for instance. So there's an interesting, and it's a big difference between architecture and car design. If you design a bad building, you're stuck with it. It's there. Maybe it'll be demolished earlier than a good building, but a lot of good buildings get demolished too. Whereas if you design a bad car, it doesn't last more than a few years. People just are not interested, and even if you're Walter Chrysler or the Fords, it's a failure, and huge amounts of money are invested, and then it goes nowhere. So the sort of interaction between the consumer and the producer is very different than in architecture. In architecture, you're kind of stuck with the building and you adapt to it, whereas with a car, people won't adapt. You know, the first car with seat belts was, I think, a Nash, and they produced it as a standard feature. It wasn't an extra. It was just and the dealers started going back to Nash and saying, "Could you please take out these seat belts? People hate them, and they make us take it out. They don't like them." And they didn't. They took them out. They stopped producing, and it would be a number of years before seat belts became a standard feature. So there's an interesting sort of back and forth with car design where the consumer actually has an awful lot to say about the car. Is there any other questions? Thank you.